So John, you got to show me how to do that sometime. Okay, everybody. Thank you for joining us. This is the Town of Manlius Quarry Study Group for the Manlius Comprehensive Plan. And this is the Quarry Study Group. So I want to quickly ask everybody to put your picture on and say hello to our guest. And then he's going to talk a little bit about the impacts of mining on terrestrial ecology, which is a pretty cool topic. And then we will have a little bit of discussion with him, and then we're going to go on to talking a little bit about our survey for the comprehensive planning website. So I'm Sarah Bollinger. I'm the Deputy Supervisor for the Town of Manlius. I will pass it to our co-chair, Heather Waters.
Thanks, Sarah. Hi, Heather Waters, co-chair for comprehensive planning and a town councilor. I'm also the co-chair of the Tree Commission. So very interested for tonight's presentations, and thank you all for being here and being a part of this.
Okay, so I'm just going to call on people that I see in my boxes. So Marissa.
Hi, I'm Marissa Mims. I live in the village of Manlius. I also happen to serve on the school board. Nice to meet you.
And Jennifer.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Staples. I'm the Secretary for Sustainable Manlius, and I'm also a member of Habitat Gardeners for Central New York and a rabid environmentalist. So I'm looking forward to the talk.
Rick.
I'm Rick Hall. I represent the village of Fayetteville on the town comprehensive planning.
Elaine.
Hi, I'm Elaine Denton, Town of Manlius Counselor.
Kelly.
Hi, I'm Kelly Wells. I live on Gulf Road in Manlius, very close to the proposed site.
And Erin.
Hi, I'm Erin Trojan. I am a resident of Herscher Lane, and I'm also a landscape architect.
Okay. John, do you want to say hello?
Hi, everybody. This is John Deere, Town Supervisor, providing IT assistance for the evening.
Okay, that seems to be all that we're here. It doesn't mean a couple more people won't join while you're speaking, Mike, but please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. And it was great to meet all of you. Thank you very much for the introductions. I will introduce myself. My name is Michael Fishman. I am a certified wildlife biologist, a professional wetlands scientist, and have been a consultant, an environmental consultant for nearly 30 years. I have a Bachelor of Science degree in wildlife science from Cornell University, a Master of Science degree in conservation biology from SUNY ESF, so local schools, yay. And as I said, I've been working in this field for about 30 years. My work experience has included, I worked for the New York State DEC in the Wetland Regulatory Program and the Wildlife Program for about 4 years. Worked for a nonprofit organization in Washington, D.C. called the Wildlife Habitat Council for a few years. And following that, went into consulting and have worked for a variety of consulting firms all over the world. And most recently, about 2 years ago, started my own firm with my wife as a partner right in Fayetteville called Edgewood Environmental Consulting. I have looked over the site, looked over the expanded environmental assessment that was done by JMT, and walked the site on Sunday with Erin Trojan. Thank you very much again, Erin, for the guided tour. And I want to talk to you about basically what my observations are from the visiting the site, a little bit about what we call environmental due diligence, which is a process through which any development site has to go under the State Environmental Quality Review Act. We're required to do this for any site we develop, especially what we call greenfield sites, which are sites that are undeveloped or not previously significantly disturbed. So basically, I'm going to walk you through my site tour. I'm going to walk you through the desktop data review that we would typically do for a site like this, and make recommendations for any other things that I think might be missing from the environmental assessment. I have a few comments on the environmental assessment, and then Erin provided me with a list of questions that we can walk through towards the end. And please feel free, if you need to ask a question, to interrupt me if you need to. We don't have to wait till the end to address all the questions, but I do want to make sure we can get through all of this. So first of all, the process that we go through, as I said, is usually called environmental due diligence. It's part of the Environmental Quality Review Act review process for New York State. It includes a desktop data review where we look at data sources that are generally publicly available online. I will sometimes look at other published sources, good old-fashioned books, things like the New York State Breeding Bird Atlas and similar sources. Almost invariably always conduct site baseline studies. You can get a lot of information online. You can get a lot of information from public and published resources. However, if the site hasn't been well documented in the past, you're not going to get a lot of specific information about the specific site unless you actually visit the site and take a look for yourself. And you'll see as I go through what I'm going to discuss, why that's important. We then do a site plan review. We look at the proposed site plan for the site to say, okay, well, here's what we have. We've already established what's baseline on the site, what exists now. So what is the developer proposing to do on the site? And then we can assess the impacts of that. We can determine what kind of changes are going to be made to the site and how those changes are going to impact the wildlife species on the site, the plant species on the site, the ecological communities on the site, and what we call ecosystem services, which are benefits that humans derive from ecosystems, no matter what those ecosystems may be. From that impact assessment, we make a determination of significance. That's also part of the seeker process. And significance is determined based on really three factors: the likelihood of their occurrence, the severity of their occurrence, that is how bad they are, how severe they are, and the area that they cover. And one of the things that can really increase the significance of an impact is if that impact is occurring to a protected resource. And protected resources are resources that are protected by law, usually either the Endangered Species Act at the federal level, the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. All of those are federal laws. And then there are state laws like Article 11, which is the State Endangered Species Act, the State Wetlands Law, the Clean Water Act, which is the federal version of that. All of those protect various resources. I should also specify that I also look at other things like agricultural lands on occasion and cultural resources. I'm not a cultural resources expert. I'm not an agricultural expert. I'm not going to touch on those. I'm going to mention them. But those are also significant resources that in some cases are either protected or require some kind of environmental review. So to start the process, we look at very basic maps of the site, first of all, just to get literally a bird's eye view of the site and get an idea of what the character of the site is. So we'll look at something like a simple topography map like we have here. This is a USGS 7.5 minute topographic quadrangle map. And I've drawn on approximately the boundaries of the proposed mine site. And what we know from this is, of course, the site ranges in elevation from about 500 to 1,000 feet elevation. That 1,000 feet elevation is significant in some cases with regard to wildlife and specific species of wildlife. The center of the site, where we've got this very steep slope, wherever you have contour lines that are very, very close together, that indicates steep slopes. Anyone who's been on the site or knows the area knows that that's the local Ontario escarpment. And of course, it's more or less a cliff or very close to it. Topographic maps also indicate to some degree cover types. So where there's a green shade, it indicates there's forest, like in the northern portion of the site and the eastern side of the site. And then in the southwest corner, you see white, and that indicates a lack of forest or a cleared area. That could be open field, it could be farm field. It's just a non-forested area. We then look at aerial orthophotos. I usually try to find aerial orthophotos that show the site in a winter condition, not necessarily with snow cover, but with leaves off, because leaves off indicate several things to us. One of those things is density of forest cover. So for example, if we look in the south portion of the forested site, you see that the browns here are a bit darker than they are up north, up in here. These are a bit lighter brown. The lighter brown indicates a lower density of trees, which usually means an older forest. The darker brown usually indicates a higher density of trees, which usually means younger growth. And that tells us a little bit about the history of this site. When I walked the site with Aaron, I mentioned that it's very, very likely that this entire site was cleared at one point. It was probably all farm, with the exception of the very, very steep slopes on the site. So while just the southwest corner now is in farm cover, it's very likely that all of this area was at one time open pastures or open farm fields for row crops. A lot of it was probably pasture land. There's stone walls that separate out those fields. Those stone walls were pulled from the fields on stone boats at one time. And what the age of forest on the site tells us is that, for example, these areas where it's darker, particularly between the existing fields to the east of the existing fields, these areas were more recently taken out of agricultural production. So they were in agricultural production more recently than, for example, the area of this northern area of the site, the central area. This was taken out of production or out of pasture a longer time ago. The trees in here are probably 80 to maybe 90 years old. Some of them are 50 to 80 years old. They're kind of mixed, and I'll show you some photos of that. But that gives us an idea a little bit of the history of the site and what the history of use was. So this is not an old growth site. Some of you may be familiar with the old growth stands around Round Lake and Green Lake State Park. Old growth is considered of great value because it's a forest that's never been cut. And we don't have that situation here. All of this site at one time was very likely cleared. It's important also to note just the history of the area, and the other character of the area is that most of this area is still in agricultural production, as you can see from the surroundings, but that the northeastern United States in general is currently more forested than it's been in probably since prior to colonization. We've allowed a lot of farms to go, and they've all become forested again. This local area is a little less so, in that has experienced that less so because agriculture is a very important industry in this area. I also look at aerial ortho photos of summer vegetation cover. This just gives me an idea of density of forest, and tells me something very important about this site, in that there's a lot of contiguous forest, connected forest to this patch of land. So if we look to the northeast and to the east, if we look to the west and to the southwest, we can see very dense corridors of forest that lead away from this site or to the site, one or the other. And that means that tells us that this site is in the middle of an extensive forest corridor. Okay, and that's a corridor in which wildlife that are dependent on dense forest can travel long distances. So if we have migratory birds, for example, that depend on interior forest that's a good distance away from any edge, any break in the forest. And when I talk about edges, I'm talking about these fields, I'm talking about roads, any break in the tree canopy. Okay, there are bird species that depend on having forest interior habitat so that they don't have to compete with other bird species that tend to live closer to edges, that are aggressive, that are nest parasites or nest predators. It protects them from certain types of predators, things like red-tailed hawks or certain types of owls that prefer to hunt the edges rather than the forest interior. And so forest interior habitat's very, very important to a fairly sizable group of birds called Neotropical forest interior migrant birds. These are birds that migrate back and forth to North and South America, and they rely on forest interior to survive. When I talk about forest interior habitat is basically a forested habitat that's more than 100 meters away from any broken edge of a forest, any break in the tree canopy. So the green line that you see here on this slide indicates an approximation of what the forest interior area is in this wooded area. And this is a pretty sizable patch of forest. It's certainly in excess of 100 acres. And what's more important is if we look at this on a smaller scale, we zoom out a little bit. Again, this is the site, this Green Lakes Park over here. You will see this large patch of forest interior. If you look throughout the region, There is not another patch of forest interior this large for quite a distance off in any direction. You can also see that this is a large connective corridor. I'm hoping you folks can see my cursor moving back and forth here. But if I go to the west, there's a forested corridor, a fairly sizable one, that leads down to the south west and comes up into here, connects with Green Lake State Park across Route 5, continues down through here, goes south of the existing Kinsella mine, and continues into this patch of woods, which then dives south. If you go to the west, this passes through and around the Ridge Golf Course, goes down across Salt Springs Road and heads down towards Chittenango Falls over here. So this is a fairly sizable and significant forested corridor that allows forest-dependent species, forest-dependent wildlife species, to travel long distances, to commute long distances if they have large ranges, or to migrate long distances if they're migratory. And when you start to break up that canopy or break up that forest interior habitat, that can create a barrier to their movement. And that's what's called habitat fragmentation. And it's something that in ecology and conservation biology, we try to avoid. We try to maintain the continuity, the connectiveness, if you will, of habitats. So I've got a few things overlaid here. The yellow is still the property boundary. You know that the green is the forest interior habitat. The pink is an approximation of the proposed mine footprint. I will freely confess I took the access road a little too far over here, but I also wanted to note that the access road as drawn on the plan that they submitted, or that is part of the record to date, only shows the width of the road itself. And a road that has to go down a very steep slope has to switch back like this. It has to go through these tight turns. To go sideways along the side of the slope. And when you build a road like that, you have to bring in tremendous volumes of fill. Even if you cut it into the hillside, there has to be tremendous volumes of fill brought to the downhill side of the road to make any width of road at all. That slope has to be graded out, and it's usually graded out at a 2-to-1 ratio, 2 feet of distance to 1 foot of fall or drop. And so it can really, the area of impact, or the footprint of impact of that road is going to be substantially larger than what they're showing. It's probably going to be something closer to what this blue line is here and here, and it may be substantially larger than that. I tried to be a little conservative. But what I really want you to take away from this is all the area that's within the blue line here and the pink line here is all of the forest interior habitat that could potentially be removed from this site. And it is a substantial amount. And all of that break in the forest canopy creates a barrier to movement of forest-dependent species. It also opens up the tree canopy and reduces the amount of forest interior habitat so that forest interior dependent species then have to compete with what are called edge species, which are species that favor living on the edges of forests, which can be both more aggressive in some cases, can compete with forest interior species, or sometimes, in fact, prey on them or parasitize them. They lay their eggs in their nests and decrease their fitness. So it can affect forest interior species quite substantially. So having reviewed the maps and gotten an idea of the character of the site, we then start doing the desktop data review. And the first thing we start with, we start at the largest government agencies, the federal government, and we start looking at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services data online on what they call their IPAC system, the Information for Planning and Consultation System. And the IPAC system provides data of known locations. I want to emphasize this. This is previously known or detected locations of threatened and endangered species, eagles, and birds of conservation concern. And birds of conservation concern may be protected under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, but they're not necessarily endangered. But they're birds that have been identified as being potentially imperiled because their habitat is decreasing or something similar to that. And then it also provides information on wetlands. So if we look at the IPAC output for this specific site, it identifies the eastern Massasauga rattlesnake. It's a pygmy rattlesnake that occurs in central New York, which is a threatened species federally. It indicates the monarch butterfly, which is a candidate species. The monarch is not officially listed yet, but it has been proposed for listing as endangered, although that's not final. The American hartstongue fern. The American hartstongue fern is the rarest fern species in New York State. It only occurs in Onondaga and Madison County. It only occurs on north-facing slopes with dolomitic limestone, and this site has all of those characteristics. That doesn't necessarily mean it's there, but it means this site has the right conditions to support it, and that's important. As far as birds of conservation concern, it indicated a fairly long list. Some of the species definitely don't occur on the site. I only listed the ones that could potentially occur on the site, and that's because there just wasn't habitat for the others. It included bald eagle, but there is no bald eagle habitat on the site to speak of. But the three species that are notable are black-billed cuckoo, blue-winged warbler, and wood thrush. None of these are uncommon species, but they're vulnerable because they are forest interior species. I should note, Indiana bat was also indicated on the IPAC system. And I put 2 question marks there because the Indiana bat, there's a known Indiana bat hibernaculum that once had a population of several thousand endangered Indiana bats in Jamesville. That's a little bit more than 5 miles from the site. In fact, it's about 5 to 6.5 miles from the site. And the New York State DEC arbitrarily gives a range for the Indiana bat from its hibernacula at 5 miles from a hibernation site if they're not known to travel in a particular direction. We know that Indiana bats from the Jamesville hibernaculum tend to disperse from the hibernaculum in a northwesterly direction towards Cayuga County. I spent several years studying that population of Indiana bats for my master's degree. So I'm familiar with those. I know most of the bats in Jamesville by first name. What's important is, go ahead.
I just wanted to thank you very much for that joke. That was great. Or maybe.
Okay. But anyway, the Indiana bat is a very important species in our region. That being said, we know a fair amount about its distribution patterns. We know that it has never been detected in New York State above 900 feet elevation. And remember, this site is, a good portion of this site is above 900 feet in elevation. So it's not likely that the Indiana bat occurs on this site. However, there are other bat species that live in our area that are not as well studied. We understand a lot of things about them, but there have not been species-specific surveys for them because of the nature of their current listing. I'll get to that in a minute. But they were not identified by IPAC, and so they were not noted in the expanded environmental assessment form. Now, the eastern Massasauga rattlesnake does occur in central New York, but we also know that it only occurs in Cicero Swamp. It does not extend beyond Cicero Swamp very far, and so it's not likely to be found on this site. I will also rule out monarch butterfly simply because there really isn't very much appropriate habitat for them. They rely entirely on common milkweed. There are open fields on the site where milkweed could grow around the perimeter, but there aren't really great concentrations of milkweed there. So while monarch butterflies may pass through the site, they're not likely to use the site extensively. However, as I said, American hartstongue fern is certainly at least a possibility. I'm not going to say it's a likelihood, but there ought to be surveys done at the right time of year when it's visible on all the appropriate habitats on the site to make sure that it's not on the site before they excavate. I then reviewed New York State DEC has distributed a document called the Northern Long-Eared Bat Occurrences by Town. The last update for that was 2018. So along with Indiana bat as a question mark on the site, it's within the range of the hibernaculum. It could be on the site, although most of the site is above its preferred elevations. American hartstongue fern. The northern long-eared bat's an important species to consider for this site. The northern long-eared bat was at one time virtually considered ubiquitous. It was found in every woodlot everywhere within its range. I've been working with bats for more than 30 years. Prior to 2006, when white nose syndrome, a disease that's killed off a lot of these species, a lot of these bat species, came to the US, I could not go out to do a bat survey without capturing northern long-eared bats in virtually every site I ever surveyed. And so nobody paid a lot of attention to them because they were so common. The white nose syndrome disease that came in 2006, which was discovered in New York, has decimated the northern long-eared bat. It has reduced their population by 99% in the state. And they were listed in 2016 as a threatened species as a result. And the reason they were listed as a threatened species was because there was a strong lobby against listing them as endangered, because if they were listed as endangered, there would be very severe restrictions on tree clearing because they roost in trees during the summertime. So they were listed as threatened. And as a threatened species, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was able to promulgate a special rule under Section 4D of the Endangered Species Act, which allows tree clearing because tree clearing is recognized as not being the cause of their endangerment or they're becoming threatened. However, the Fish and Wildlife Service announced earlier this year that they will be relisting the northern long-eared bat later this year as an endangered species. It will no longer be threatened, it'll be endangered. The Section 4D rule then goes away, and that may result in substantial restrictions on tree clearing. We don't know if it will yet, but it's possible. So I do think that certainly the habitat on the site is appropriate for northern long-eared bat. They could use it. I think the chances of northern long-eared bat being on the site are very, very small, simply because there's so few of them. But I do know that this is within their range, the habitat's appropriate, and therefore they should be looked for. I want to emphasize that there is a known hibernation site in the town of Manlius for northern long-eared bat. It's documented by DEC. That's what led me to this conclusion. So we know that they at least historically hibernated here, and I think it's worthwhile requesting a survey of the site to determine whether or not they might still be present.
Do you know where that hibernation area is?
I do, but I'm not going to tell you where it is.
Okay.
It's an endangered species breeding site, so I can't tell you. Well, I can tell you it's towards James, but it's I can't give away specific locations. So the next source I checked was the Environmental Assessment Form Mapper, or the EAF Mapper that DEC provides online. It's an interactive tool, very useful. And this is what was likely checked for the preparation, for JMT's preparation of the expanded environmental assessment form. This is what everybody checks for that. It indicates that there are no threatened or endangered species on the site. And according, per DEC, that is true. There are no known records because there haven't been any surveys done on the site. Okay. It indicated that the site is within an agricultural, a designated agricultural district, Onondaga County Agricultural District number 3. It indicated that it's adjacent to a National Register of Historic Places or state eligible listing site, which is the old Manlius Stone Schoolhouse. It indicated that the site was potentially significant for archaeological sites. That's in part probably due to the lime kilns that are on the site, as well as the fact that the site is immediately adjacent to Pools Brook. Native Americans are known to have tended to use and gather around areas where there was running water. So it's quite possible that there are archaeological remains on the site. It should be surveyed for that. And I believe the EAF indicated that they were going to do that. It indicated surface waters, that's Pools Brook, 100-year floodplain, probably also for Pools Brook, and a principal aquifer being underneath the site. But you've all discussed that, I believe, with other folks. The next source we checked was the New York State DEC's environmental resource map. On that, the gray area here is the site. And I'll go through the color codes just so you understand what they are. The little green dot that you see in the middle of the site is a federal wetland, a federally mapped wetland. That just means that the federal government identified a small wetland spot there through aerial infrared photography some time ago. It has to be checked at the ground level and mapped at the ground level to determine the extent and whether or not it can actually be a jurisdictional wetland, that is one that they regulate under the Clean Water Act. This nice blue squiggly line that indicates Pools Brook. Blue lines are mapped surface water resources in the state of New York. Pools Brook is one of those. This kind of light lime green with a lighter green buffer around it is a state regulated wetland. The nearest state regulated wetland is probably 3/4 of a mile to the west. The pink color that you see in the upper left is a significant ecological community. And that significant ecological community is one of the more dominant forest types at Green Lakes State Park, and it's called a maple basswood rich mesic forest. It has a particular species assemblage, and I will come back to that. And then this yellowish color that you see in the lower left is an indication of an endangered species. And when you identify what that endangered species is for here, it's listed bat species. So you can see that listed bat species are known from their general range to be fairly close to the site. They're just not mapped on the site. Does that mean they're not there? No, it doesn't. It means that they've never been surveyed there. And that's an important distinction. So what do we know from this site? Well, I mentioned Pools Brook is a Class C standard CT stream. That means it's a trout brook. It's clean enough water to support trout. However, it's off the site. So technically speaking, it doesn't fall under regulation for this activity simply because Article 15, the Stream Protection Act for New York State, only regulates activities on the bed and banks of the stream in question. Usually they may take that out to a 50-foot buffer, but I don't think the site comes within 50 feet of, or at least the development portion of the site comes within 50 feet of the creek. The significant natural communities I mentioned is maple basswood rich mesic forest that is rated or classified as what's called an S3 site in New York State. That's the state classification. It indicates that there's somewhere between 21 and 100 occurrences of that type, that cover type in the state. That's not very many in a state as large as New York. And it indicates that there's a limited acreage of that cover type in New York. And the T&E species were listed bat species. So in summary, what we learned just from the desktop review was that there's a small isolated federal wetland on the site. It's an isolated wetland. It's not connected to any surface waters or navigable waters in any way, and therefore it's not likely to be protected under the Clean Water Act. So that's more or less a write-off. T&E species, field presence and absence surveys are really needed for northern long-eared bat and hart's tongue fern on the site. The maple basswood rich mesic forest, Aaron may recall when we walked the site, the dominant tree species that we found on the site were maple, basswood, white ash, black cherry, tulip tree. Those are all species that are identified specifically for this cover type. It also indicates that the maple basswood rich mesic forest cover type generally has a dense understory and ground cover of what are called spring ephemeral wildflowers, including wild leeks, including bloodroot, including a number of other species like trillium, all of which we observed when we were on the site, which leads me to believe that at least the eastern and northeastern forest on that site is a maple basswood rich mesic forest, and it should be documented and mapped for consideration by the New York Natural Heritage Program. As I indicated, agricultural district, National Register of Historic Places, principal aquifer, those all have to be addressed separately. But going to this, we took a look, of course, at the farm fields. Not anything particularly extraordinary about the farm fields, and I apologize to any farmers out there. They're certainly prime farmland soils. The Department of Ag and Markets will probably consider that of significance, and will want to know, and will want to consider the potential impacts to this site. I will tell you that the Department of Ag and Markets has stepped up their protection of prime farmland soils throughout the state, particularly with the onslaught of or the increase in solar development across the state, because a lot of solar developers want to develop in farmlands. And there is a concern about the loss of good farmland soil in New York State and a loss of that to large scale developments like solar sites. But this type of development certainly figures into that as well and would take out all of these farm fields. We visited the little pocket wetland on the site. This would be classified as something called a woodland pool. It probably is flooded year round based on the aerial photographs that I looked at, but it probably doesn't stay as large as this. It may get a little bit smaller. On particularly dry years, it may dry out completely. We did find salamander eggs in it. We did find some caddisflies, which indicate that the water quality is pretty good. There were a pair of wood ducks that were checking it out, probably looking for a place to nest for this year. Nice little wetland, but it is really the only surface water source on the entire site that's within the bounds of the property. Pools Brook is off-site. So from a water resource standpoint for wildlife, this would be an important resource because it's the only source of surface water. And as we walked around the site, you could see very plainly droppings and tracks of a wide variety of wildlife species that plainly come to this site to drink. Moving around the site kind of in a counterclockwise direction. The west side, this is a mature successional forest. When I say successional forest, what that means is that the site has been cleared once before. It's been completely cleared, or almost so. And that would have been for farming, probably in 17 or 1800s. And that's when they would have cleared the stones from the field and built the stone walls that crossed through the forest. And those, all of those stone wall delineated fields were probably used as pastures for cattle. And then crops were grown up at the top to feed the cattle, just like they still do, only they don't have cattle on the site anymore. But we would call this uneven aged because you can see there's some large trees in here, probably up to 50 or 80 years old. Then there's also some very small trees mixed in. There's a wide variety of size classes of trees. So it tells you that these trees have come in over a long period of time after the farm was abandoned. As we move up farther north to another area, again, this was probably an open pasture site on a bench, a relatively flat bench on the site. And you'll notice that there's a much higher density of trees here, a lot more trees and a lot smaller trees. That just means this site was allowed to go fallow or abandoned, if you will, much more recently. And so the trees grow very, very densely at first until the ones that grow faster shade out the ones that grow slower, and the ones that grow slower die off because they get shaded out. And ultimately, you'll end up with an uneven aged stand like you have on the rest of the site if this is allowed to grow. The north end of the site, where you get up to the steep slopes, you begin to see much larger trees, more mature trees, again, uneven aged trees. Right in the center of the photo here, you can see this very, very large tree. That's a tree that's probably more than 100, maybe 120, 150 years old. That tree may never have been cut. That may be a very, very old tree that was left because it was on a steep slope, or it was in a place that was inconvenient to cut, or because the farmer may have decided to leave one or two single trees out in an open field in a pasture so that the cattle would have some shade. Now, you can see if when you look at this photograph, this is up in the northeast portion of the property, a substantial change here. And that is, you'll see ground cover, a lot of green ground cover. This is a very dense coverage of wild leek, a mixture of spring ephemeral wildflowers in amongst the wild leeks. This is where I would say you have the primary density of maple, basswood, rich mesic forest. This is, if you read the definition out of Ecological Communities of New York State, this is exactly what it's describing. A site that's dominated by a mixture of maples, basswood, lesser trees are white oak, red oak, white ash, tulip tree, black cherry, and has a dense carpet of wild leek and spring ephemeral wildflowers. This is an exact description of that cover type. And so this is a significant ecological community in New York State. It may not be necessarily rare, but 21 to 100 occurrences throughout the state isn't very common necessarily. So it's something to be considered. And as you come south through this woodlot, down into this area, you see there's an increase in density of tree cover. But there's still that ground cover. So it's the same ground cover. It's just a younger age class. This area was stopped farming much more recently than this area, probably having to do with the slope in the area. This probably was farm field at one time, similar to these fields, and this was probably pasture. So cattle were abandoned here before the farming was, before the crop farming was. So I went through the expanded environmental assessment review. Just a few comments I wanted to raise on things that you want to look for when you read a study like this. Under section 1, the introduction, they talk about the current land use of the site. being vacant land. Vacant land is not a land use. The land use here is agricultural and undeveloped forest. And that's how it should be described. Vacant tells you nothing about the character of the site. And so it's not really very clear. When we get into environmental setting description of the site, it indicates no other rare, endangered, or threatened species or significant natural communities are reported to exist within or near the mine site. That is absolutely accurate, but it's not necessarily correct. It's accurate because there's nothing reported in the published data that are available online or in printed publications. However, it's because the site's never been surveyed for any of these things. And if you don't survey a site, of course, you're never going to find anything. So that's why it's very, very important to do site-specific surveys. The report also indicates that the New York Natural Heritage Program has no known records of the plant. And I think they're indicating Hart's tongue fern within or in close proximity to the mine site. That's also true. However, it doesn't include a copy of the New York Natural Heritage Program letter, and all of their response letters include the following disclaimer, which says, for most sites, comprehensive field surveys have not been conducted. And that the data provided is not a substitute for site-specific field surveys. So again, it's very important that this site be properly surveyed by an experienced wildlife biologist, botanist, ecologist, who knows what they're looking for and knows what time of year to find it. Hart's tongue fern, it cannot be found in the wintertime. It cannot be found this early in the spring. It's not really evident yet. So it has to be surveyed for at the right time of year. Looking at impacts of the proposed actions, there's a statement in section 331, proposed mining activities will not result in any significant impact to vegetation. All I can tell you is that that's a bald-faced lie. If you are going to clear an entire forested site, and it will ultimately look, even if it's restored to a grassland, that is a significant change in vegetation cover. It's a significant change in local wildlife corridors. It's a significant change in forest interior content for the area. All of those are significant. They cover large areas. They are a severe change, and they have impacts on local wildlife populations. And again, I'll throw it out there again. Hart's tongue fern survey should be conducted. Northern long-eared bat survey should be conducted, and the maple basswood rich mesic forest should be documented. They also state in the report, as a result of the absence of endangered or threatened species on the property, no significant impacts are anticipated. Okay, it's true that the standards by which a lot of sites are assessed these days is if we're not going to harm any endangered species, then it's not an impact. Well, that's not entirely true. First of all, of course, northern long-eared bat and Hart's tongue fern may well be on the site. We just need to make that determination through surveys. But it's important to note that even common species of wildlife, white-tailed deer, eastern wild turkey, possums, raccoons, squirrels, what have you, that are living on the site will all be displaced by human activity and habitat disruption on the site. Those wildlife have to then find new territories. It's all well and good. This is often presented in a somewhat dismissive way of saying they'll relocate off-site. Don't worry about them. Well, they will relocate off-site. But the problem is that there's already wildlife off-site. So that means they have to go and compete with those wildlife that are off-site to establish new territories, to compete for resources that are then more limited because there's less of them. That creates a stress. It decreases their fitness to survival and therefore can harm them. But because those species are not protected under the Endangered Species Act, we don't usually consider that. That's not to say it's not an impact. It is an impact. Is it an allowable impact? Well, yes, it is, because there's no law that says we can't do that. Also, when a mine is created, you're not only removing vegetation, which creates a break in a habitat, but you're also creating topographic cliffs and drops and head walls that make it impossible for certain wildlife species to cross the site. So any wildlife species that comes up to the edge of the site now has to walk all the way around the perimeter, which requires a substantial increase in energy expenditure to travel that distance. So it does create a stress on the local wildlife. It also pushes wildlife into closer contact with humans. You will find that deer will, if deer can spend their entire time in the woods on that site now, they're happy. There's plenty of food for them. There's plenty of space for them. When that all goes away, they start looking for garden plants. if there's a shortage of food in the woods. So you'd start running into human-wildlife conflicts. Under mitigation measures, they indicate vegetation. They will limit the disturbance through phased clearing. That is a reasonable measure, a reasonable minimization measure. If you're not clearing wholesale 300 acres of land, you're only clearing a few acres at a time, that decreases the level of your impact incrementally. But over the course of the lifespan of the mine, the impact is still significant. Proposed reclamation will create early successional cover types. Early successional cover types are valuable. We certainly need more grasslands in New York State to help a declining population of grassland songbirds, but it doesn't replace mature forest. It doesn't necessarily replace the biodiversity that's lost from that mature forest, but it does diversify structural cover types and biodiversity overall, because the more cover types that you have, the more biodiversity you have, the more species can be supported in that area. Their note of 6 inches of overburden being used for reclamation. Overburden is soil, but it's not necessarily topsoil. It's whatever soil they happen to have held on to or have available on the site. Topsoil is more fertile. However, in a mining situation, topsoil is usually sold. It's the first product that's sold because it's a marketable product. There are people who will buy topsoil. But overburden, even if it's fertilized and had lime added to it to correct its pH, won't support deep-rooted plants or trees of any kind. So in reestablishing vegetation on the site, they're never going to make it a forested site again. It will only be an early successional site, which means open field or shrubland. They note their planting mix, which is 3 native grass species. I applaud the fact that they're native grass species, but 3 species of grass does not replace even close the biodiversity that will be lost from the site from the clearing and change of land use. Under mitigation measures for wildlife, phased clearing will minimize potential wildlife impacts. Yes, it will over time. It basically stretches the impact over time because you're clearing small pieces at a time. However, the amount of area stripped of vegetation at any one time will be limited to the area needed to accommodate approximately 1 year's mining. That's stated in the report, but it never states how much area that is. How much area do they intend to take per year? How much do they need for 1 year's mining? That's never specified. Is it 2 acres? Is it 50 acres? We don't know. And that makes a big difference in the impact assessment. The affected area includes land cover type of primarily agriculture. That's a direct quote from the report. It's also inaccurate. Roughly half to 2/3 of the mined area from their own plan, plus the access road, are forested, including a section of significant ecological community. So I now want to address the questions. Nobody's interrupted me yet to ask questions. So I'm going to address the written questions that Aaron provided me, and hopefully we can take care of these. And if there's any more, please feel free to ask. So the first one was, what role does the site play in a larger picture of maintaining a diverse flora and fauna population? It certainly supports forest interior songbirds and forest interior species in general, eastern wild turkeys, so on. And I think it's an important local resource for that in and of itself, because it's probably one of the largest patches of forest interior habitat we have in the region. How would the site be cataloged to determine whether there are any species of plants or animals that should be protected from habitat destruction? That goes back to my recommendation that the site needs to have a site-specific natural resource inventory. And when I say natural resource inventory, it should be plants and animals. For a site this size, for an impact area of this significance, I would frankly recommend what we call a 3-season survey, or a growing season survey, so that you're sampling in both in the spring, the summer, and the fall, which encompasses the entire growing season. Because there are plants that appear here in the fall that are not evident in the spring. There are species that appear in the spring that are not evident in the fall. And there are species that appear in the summer that are not evident in either the spring or the fall. So to get a really complete picture of the species diversity that occupies this site, you really have to look throughout the growing season, and that basically encompasses April through October in this region. How would the site be monitored during disturbance to be sure no plants or animals that have been identified to be protected are preserved? If they do not identify any endangered species on the site, it will not be monitored for that. or it may not be monitored for that. There's not necessarily any requirement that they do that. If endangered species are identified on the site, those sites will be monitored. There will be permits that have to be generated for that from DEC under Article 11, which is the Endangered Species Act for the state of New York. It's called an incidental take permit. I can tell you, for example, that Hanson Mine down in Jamesville has such a permit because they have to deal with Indiana bats in their site. They do have Indiana bats that occupy their site, and they have to make sure that they're not disturbing them when they do, for example, blasting or clearing of a new area. Fourth question. Could phased restoration of the site benefit the ecology of the site rather than a sweeping reclamation at the end of the mine life? Yes, that it definitely would. If you clear the entire site, you're ultimately going to end up with a clearing in excess of 200 acres. However, if you're clearing a few acres a year, and as you complete an area, you then reestablish vegetation in that small area, then you have a much smaller working face of the mine, for one. You have a much smaller area of unvegetated or areas that are not protected by vegetation. So all of that is to the benefit of restoring some kind of a naturalistic vegetative cover. I say naturalistic because they're not going to restore a natural cover necessarily. It's naturalistic in that it will contain some native species, but it's certainly not going to contain a natural biodiversity. Question 5, how is monitoring post-reclamation done to determine whether the site is meeting the needs of the terrestrial fauna and flora? Who typically pays for this? There is generally monitoring post-reclamation to ensure that the site has complied with the reclamation plan that was approved in the mining permit. That does not necessarily address terrestrial fauna or flora. Usually the plan, when it's approved, there is a specific seed mix that's specified. Yes, they will go back and monitor to make sure the seed mix takes root and gets established, has a certain percentage of ground cover established with rooted vegetation. And that's all paid for by the mine. That all has to, and in some cases, the mine has to put up a bond initially so that if something happens to the mine company or the company that owns the mine, if something happens financially and they go broke, or if they go out of business or something like that happens, there's money that has already been set aside in a bond that pays for that, so the DEC can then draw on that bond and do the reclamation. So there has to be a financial guarantee that the restoration will be done. Examples of reclaimed quarries at different stages that you may visit in person or online that are successful in ecological restoration. I am personally not aware of any of these. That does not mean they don't exist. I will say that mine land reclamation is still a fairly young science. For many, many years, mines were closed, and the only requirement was that you reduce potential risks to human health and safety. And that very often meant you build a berm around it, you build a berm across all the roads, or you cut out the roads so nobody can go in and accidentally fall into a pit or drive around the site and have accidents. So therefore, that was sufficient. Nowadays, there is more of a demand for ecological restoration, but of course, a lot of that was developed more recently, and the mines for which it was developed aren't yet reclaimed. So we don't really know what the results are going to be. Question 7, after 50 years of removing materials, 6 inches of overburden or even soil will do little to mitigate the impact of the quarry on the landscape. That's true. I really don't have anything else to say about that other than 6 inches of soil doesn't replace the native topsoil. It doesn't replace the native biodiversity. The seeding that they're proposing to do of 3 native species of grass, your lawn has more than 3 species of grass in it, just from ordinary grass seed. They're not native, mind you, but any open field has dozens of species. And anything that's called a native reclamation ought to have that many. And finally, can natural heritage be protected regardless of its protected status? Should biodiversity be protected to protect the resilience of local natural communities? The answer to the first question is no, there are no laws that protect biodiversity or natural heritage in general. They have to be species that are at risk of being lost. Unfortunately, we tend not to do anything about protecting species until we're getting ready to lose them. Should biodiversity be protected to protect the resilience of local natural resource or local natural communities? Well, in my opinion, yes, they should, but there's no law that requires us to do that. So it's a somewhat difficult situation. Does that mean the town can't pass laws? No, the town can pass their own laws that require that. That's part of what a planning process can be about. How difficult is that to enforce? Extremely difficult. It requires qualified people to do it, for one, and there aren't a lot of those to go around. With that, I've talked for almost an hour, and I know you folks have other things that you want to discuss. I'm happy to hear any vocal questions anybody has, verbal questions, and address those. Other than that, I'm done.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you very much. That was extremely thorough. I have one question. If you are aware of, is there anything in reclamation that could be done that would actually support trees again? I mean, do you need 6 feet of soil? Like what is needed to actually support an area where it could regrow into forest?
I would say 6 feet is almost a minimum that you would need for a tree to be able to develop a root system of any kind. And that's not a very deep root system. The trees that are growing on that site now have root systems that penetrate the soil, I'm sure 30 to 50 feet. Root systems very often mirror branching systems in trees. So if you see a tree that has a branching system that extends 65 feet up into the air, it's not unlikely that its root system can extend that deep into the ground.
I've actually seen that in person when a tree fell and its babies grew up all around, that the root system had gone out, yards and yards and yards away from the parent tree.
Many, many years ago on the east end of Long Island, an artist hydro excavated a tree out of the ground so that he could excavate the entire root system intact. And then he turned the tree upside down and replanted it as a demonstration of what the root system would look like. Wow. And it almost looked like a normal tree.
Very cool. All right, I'm going to open it up for other people to ask questions. So if you can just unmute yourselves and dive in.
I would first just like to thank Mr. Kinsella for letting us walk the property the other day.
Yes.
It was very kind and generous of him to give us permission to do that. And, for us to be able to understand the site a little bit better and allow people like Mr. Fishman to come in and educate us a little bit more on the property. So thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'll add to that. It was a pleasure walking the site. It's a beautiful site.
Yeah. Do you want to take your slides down and then you can see everybody that's asking you questions? Heather, how about you? And Elaine, let's see. One of you guys must have a question.
Are you familiar with any planning boards or organizations or educational sessions that municipal bodies like ours end up going to learn more about how to read and understand these forms, basically? Because some of us, it certainly isn't there in any of the training if you're a newly elected person. And you're completely reliant on people, seeking out people like you to feed in or to be like paying attention to what's going on, or our wonderful, colleagues. That's my question.
Okay. I can offer two possibilities there. One is there's an organization in the Hudson Valley, and this is a bit of a reach only because they tend to specialize in just the Hudson Valley. But there's an organization there called Hudsonia Limited. They're based out of Bard College, and they do offer programs to municipalities, municipal agencies, training them in biodiversity survey, environmental impact assessment, things of that nature. Okay. I don't know if they do that outside the Hudson Valley, but I do know that they do a very thorough job in the Hudson Valley. And I'll apologize for shameless self-promotion, but I own a consulting firm, and part of our mission is education. And so that's part of the services we offer. And if you wanted to, have us come and do programs or develop a specific program for the town board to train you in how to review an EIS or even an environmental assessment form, the EAF, find out where that data comes from, the kinds of questions you might want to be asking. I've been as I said, I've been a consultant for 30 years. A lot of the work that I've done over that time is what's called third-party review. I will be hired by a town board to do a third-party professional review of an application that's pending before the board. Basically, I'll go through and review all of the information for you and point out where I think there might need to be some additions, there might need to be changes, where I see if there are any problems. And sometimes there aren't, sometimes there are very few. I can honestly tell you in all the years I've done that, I've never found an application that didn't have something that needed to be done. Because, and that's not a commentary on bad consultants doing the work. It's things get missed, or in some cases, they feel that they've done an adequate job. Our opinions might differ on that. I'm a strong believer in making sure that the resources are protected. I think it's quite possible to develop quite a bit in this world, but still protect a valuable resource. I want to emphasize. I want to emphasize too. I told Aaron this, and I told Sarah this when we started. I'm absolutely not against mining or development. I work for mining companies. I have worked for mining companies for many, many years, getting permits for them to operate. There are good places for mines to be. There are less good places for mines to be, but mines have to be where the resource is. They are limited. They can't just, you can't make a mine just anywhere. You have to be where the resource is. So that's an important factor to remember. And resource extraction is one of the things that people oppose most strongly because it's usually pretty ugly. Okay, whether it's tree cutting, I've worked in the timber industry in Oregon with spotted owls. I've worked in mining. I've worked in all sorts of resource extraction industries, what those are called. They're never pretty. They never are. But we need those resources. Those resources are a necessary thing in our society. And we all create that demand. Okay, oil drilling, gas drilling, any of those. We all create the demand. Okay, we all want paved roads, and paved roads require rock. Okay, and so they're all very important, and they have to be where the resource is. So the question then comes down to, how do we do it in an environmentally wise way to make sure we don't lose a valuable resource?
Thank you so much. I have one other question. The DEC is sort of the end all be all for us, right? In a lot of ways, we are in relationship with the DEC as a policy making body ourselves and representing the people. Are there other agencies? You mentioned the federal sort of laws that sort of also intersect with us that we're not as close with. We work with the DEC, but we also work really closely with our county planning agencies. Are there other? I ask about other agencies that we should be developing relationships with to understand the full scope of this, based on it comes to wildlife conservation or just understanding biodiversity in our own community, given the pressures on biodiversity that are coming with climate change and sort of the adaptations that are coming up, the futuristic look. Where do we go for that, in your opinion?
Okay. Well, the DEC is really your first and foremost, because they are the agency that is tasked with protecting the environment in New York State. There are branches, if you will, I guess. The New York Natural Heritage Program is part of that, but the New York Natural Heritage Program is not a regulatory agency. It's an information agency. Okay, they collect information on rare, threatened, and endangered species, significant natural communities, things like that, and they warehouse that information. They conduct research, and that's a very valuable information resource. But don't forget, it's limited. It's limited by what's been looked at. If it hasn't been looked at, there isn't anything there on their maps and on their databases. Okay, so when they say we don't have any record of an endangered species on a site, that doesn't mean there isn't an endangered species on the site. That means they don't have a record of one because no one's ever surveyed it. Okay, and in order to demonstrate that a particular endangered species is not on a site, you have to have a very specific survey done, and that survey has to have a negative result. That negative result really only tells you that it's not likely that they're there. You can never say they're not there. You can't prove a negative. Okay, it's not possible to prove a negative. You can only prove a positive, or do a thorough enough job looking for something to say that if we looked this hard, we should have detected it. We looked this hard, we didn't detect it, therefore it's not likely to have been there.
Thank you.
Other than that, for natural resource agencies, you can look into USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service for soils information and farming information. The county planning agency is probably directly connected already with an agricultural agency and with the Department of Ag and Markets. That's pretty much it. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, of course. But that's pretty much going to be all of your natural resource agencies.
Thank you. Other questions from the group?
Sure, I'll jump in there. So I was fascinated to hear you talk about the ecological, for want of a better word, if I'm not using the right terms, corridors that wildlife use. And I assume, because you didn't say so, that there's no particular regulation of what corridors need to exist, which ones need to not be divided up, that sort of thing. Is that correct? There's no regulation of things like that?
There's not currently a regulatory requirement that a wildlife corridor be preserved or that it be protected in any way. Mm-hmm. That being said, that can be a function of a planning agency. Okay, so a town planning board and part of a comprehensive plan, for example, many years ago, I did a project for a town in southern New York where we did a full natural resource inventory of the entire town. Looked at wildlife corridors, looked at biodiversity, looked at rare threat and endangered species locations, wetland locations. We mapped everything. And that was basically for them to use as a planning tool for resources that ought to be protected. And they were able to put into their own regulations, presumably when they were going through the planning process. I didn't finish out the planning process with them, but in their planning process, that gives them the opportunity at least to understand what those resources are, what value they have, so that when they're planning land use throughout their town, they can say, well, we have this large forested corridor that crosses the entire town. We'd like to try to keep that as intact as possible. So is it okay to eat in at the edge of that? Well, yes, that has less of an impact than cutting out a big hole in the middle, for example. Okay, so from an ecological standpoint, that's a better approach, and it can be regulated at the local level. You can have local zoning regulations that incorporate that.
That sounds like an astounding tool. I would love the town of Manlius to think about that. That would be amazing. But then, so my follow-up question is, if corridors are not regulated, if the things that are regulated are endangered species, and you mentioned the long-eared bats and the hart's tongue fern, so it seems to me, looking at it from a high point of view, looking down and thinking to myself, all right, so there are going to be ferns that are located on this property and they need to be protected, or the bats. But isn't it true that any kind of environmental plant or animal doesn't exist as an island? Like the bats need a water source and they need roosting places and things like that.
Yes.
So how in the world do you manage protecting the endangered species within an area that you are disturbing pretty dramatically? Have you heard of places that do that well?
Well, not necessarily. There's lots of places that do it. For example, I do a lot of work with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in managing bats. Bats have been my specialty for 30 years. And so what usually happens if you have an endangered bat species on a property is you try to identify a vital resource for them. What we usually look for are roost trees. Okay, how do we do that? We go to the site, we try to capture the bats, we put radio tags on them, we radio track them, and we watch where they roost. Those roost trees are important resources. You can't cut down a roost tree, a known roost tree. You can't cut down trees around a known roost tree. They'll put a buffer of several hundred feet around it to allow it to remain connected to the surrounding forest, because the assumption is that, okay, if the bats are using roost trees in this particular woodlot, then this woodlot must have at least in part, what those bats need to survive. So we want to try to preserve that in as much intact as possible. But bats range over a tremendous area. They can forage 5 miles out in a night easily. They can go farther than that if they need to. So how much of that can you really protect? You can't protect all of it. Habitat protection is the one tool that any regulatory agency has. Okay, we can't protect the individuals of a species. You can't, I mean, other than saying you can't go out and shoot these. Okay, we can't go and put them in a glass case and protect them that way. We just have to protect the habitat that they exist in. Okay, and so habitat protection, because it's the one tool we have, when the only tool in your toolbox is a hammer, everything has to be a nail, right? And so habitat protection is the only tool we have to protect endangered species because it's the only tool we have.
So then my final question in all of this is, you mentioned that this particular area was unique in its size, the forest that exists and the fact that it is part of this corridor. When you say unique, are you talking about unique within the town, within the county, within the state, within upstate New York? How do you find this particular area to be unique?
I can't say within the town or even the local, other than the localized area I looked at in an aerial photograph. That would require an analysis, basically what we call a remote sensing analysis, a GIS analysis. Somebody would have to take GIS mapping, define all of the forest interior habitat in the area, and then size them. And I don't have the tools to do that in-house. It's certainly a doable exercise. And what scale you want to do it? Do you want to do it townwide? You could do it townwide. It's a sizable project to do, but it's doable. You could do it for a 1 mile radius around a known project. That's certainly doable as well. And so could the analysis be done? Yes, it can be done. I can't tell you if this is unique to the town. I can tell you that zooming out on Google Earth for a pretty good distance, this is the biggest chunk of forest interior habitat there is in a long distance. I think it may be larger than any of the areas of forest interior in Green Lake State Park. And that's saying something.
Okay, thank you.
And again, that's just to say it has ecological value. None of that ecological value is protected by law.
All right, I'm sensitive to our time. We've kept Mr. Fishman for quite a while now, but I want to make sure if there are other questions that people have a chance to ask. Well, this was absolutely phenomenal. We are so appreciative of the time you clearly put into developing this for the town. We really, really thank you for that. And
you're welcome.
And I want, particularly since we took you away from something else this afternoon to be with us. So we really thank you so much for this, and we will be in touch. And I want to thank all the people who helped, especially Aaron, who really helped pull this together and organize the questions and all that stuff. So thanks to everybody. If Mr. Fishman can cut out when he wants to, I want to take just a few minutes to talk about the survey with the rest of you.
Okay, thanks very much, everybody. Have a good night.
Thank you so much.
So I sent some materials around, and the first feedback I got was that we needed more open-ended questions, that I was feeding people too much by way of survey design, which I will certainly accept that critique. But I wanted to see if people had other ideas, because we really want to start getting a broader community input. Right now, we're sort of being felt that there's 50 people maybe really involved with these things, and that there's another 30,000 who are not. And we need to find ways to get more people involved. So Aileen wants to say something.
So I just wanted to, well, you kind of explained the goal of the survey to get a more broad view, but my concern is that there's already so many surveys from the comprehensive plan that to really do that community outreach, I mean, you really have to push and ask and ask and ask. So I guess to figure out what is the goal, and then to figure out what are we asking the broad support, or yeah.
Okay, so that's the good point. All right. So what Elaine is saying, so the goal is we want input from, not all 30,000, but, a lot more people than we have now. Is the survey even the right way to do that? Do people have another idea of what could work for that? Because we do definitely want to be sure. I mean, right now, we haven't even heard from everybody who's contiguous to the proposed mine, let alone people all over the area who might have an opinion. So that's kind of what I'm nervous about.
Well, I would suggest pulling in Barton LaJudas, comprehensive plan, group that we were working with initially, because they have lots of experience with this kind of stuff from a planning perspective and helping towns develop comprehensive plans. I think that they'd be really good at coming up with some ideas and ways to do this that can really get people to have feedback and, that are maybe catchy or whatever. It's not my area of expertise. So I don't mind doing surveys, but not everybody likes to do them. So I understand, but I think they're on contract, I think, with the town already. So I think that utilizing them for that would be a really good way to go. And they can even help, review the questions. I can send some feedback in an email on these questions as well.
Thank you. I would appreciate that from anybody who has ideas about the questions.
I also have an expert in my office who does the qualitative survey work. She's the person, she was trained through NYU, and she does all of our qual check stuff.
So Jessica, we didn't get a chance to introduce you at the beginning. So do you want to just tell people what your office is and how you're willing to help us? Thank you.
Absolutely. Hi, my name is Jessica Eckerlin. I work for the Environmental Finance Center, which is a state-federal partnership between Syracuse University and the EPA. And I'm housed within Syracuse University's Center for Sustainable Community Solutions, which is the big concrete-looking building on East Washington Street that has the bright green wall, if you've ever seen it. It was one of the first LEED platinum buildings ever built in the city of Syracuse. And I was actually connected with Sarah through one of my neighbors that we happened to just be chatting. And this is certainly aligns with a lot of the work that we do. We work with mostly rural communities, and I specialize in drinking water issues, but I actually know Mike Fishman from graduate school. So I'm connected, really interested in the quarry work and also the stormwater work. And so happy to connect you with any of the resources that we have at the EFC. So it sounds like we would be able to help.
Yeah, so maybe would that be something, if from a next step, if I connect with Jessica's office and actually have like professional assistance with this community engagement process, would that make people comfortable? And then we'll report out next month as far as what we decided to do.
I'm still confused on like, are we asking more about questions on the natural resource district on those questions, or are we asking more general questions? So I can talk to you after. So.
Well, I think let's everybody say that, because I learned so much tonight. I would certainly ask more questions than what I did before. And I think this whole idea of a wildlife corridor, there's lots of things that we could include in that. That we would need to explain what it was before asking people about it. So there may be some other mechanism that we need to use that's maybe, I don't know, more of a video or some kind of a one of these infographic things that sort of explains it and asks the question at the same time. So I'm open to any solution. I just really want to be sure that we get more people to let us know what they think before the board is asked to make a decision.
Yeah.
I'm happy to help out with that. If you want to, Jess, we could talk offline. I think I saw your email somewhere. I'm happy to help out with that kind of thing too.
Yeah, that would be great.
I think thank you so much, Jess. It's really nice to meet you. And for Sarah, I think that's a good idea. I would say what I'm honing in on after this conversation is we sort of have gotten the sense that we know it's a monumental decision to decide about mining in the specific area because it's 100 years or more or longer impact. And I think what we learned tonight is that we don't have the information in hand, the surveys and the data in hand about how to weigh 100-year impact that we sort of know versus what we know about the land itself, and how it plays into the larger, the whole town. And so I think that's that concept of, I think this process is telling me from a comprehensive planning perspective that we don't even have a tree inventory. Right. So there are lots of things we don't have. So I think it's going to, excuse me, I was eating my dinner earlier. It's going to encourage us to make the case for investing resources also as a community in understanding the community in these ways is what I'm saying. So I think the survey and the questions have to be showing the value of doing that kind of work, or getting grants for that work, or whatever it is.
Exactly. I think it's really important that the town considers taking on a third-party consultant. I think Mr. Fishman touched on that. I've seen that happen all over, in planning and planning boards and that kind of thing. And because the qualifications needed to make some of these decisions and understand the data and even what questions to ask, like we're talking about with the survey, on a larger scale, there are outfits and individuals who specialize in assisting town boards, and for a small cost relative, it would be very, very prudent for the town to consider engaging a consultant to help them through this process and know what questions to ask and what to review and go from there.
I think even our uneducated reading of the materials they presented found a lot of errors and omissions. So having somebody who could really dive into that is definitely something that I would be interested in doing. So I think we need to, in fact, I think we will. I think we just need to identify a process to engage somebody to do that.
And that's not uncommon to find in a preliminary application submitted like it was. It's meant to open the door for conversation. That doesn't mean that Kinsella's consultants are in any way, unprepared or incompetent with regards to their preparation. Not at all. They're a reputable company. It's just kind of how business is done sometimes to get the ball rolling. Without speaking for them, I'm sure they know they will have some more work to do down the road. And so this was never meant to be a final end thing. So it's just meant to kind of get things started, which is where the town picks up.
Yep. Okay. Anything else for tonight?
I would like to just echo what Jessica was just saying or implying, and that is if you've got somebody who's actually got skills in preparing surveys, that's something that you really want to do. I've done surveys for smaller groups on a very small scope, and things I've discovered is people have a very short attention span and they have busy lives. And people who have gone to school to put surveys together know how to word the questions. And also don't assume that if we send a survey out, just don't assume, oh, everybody's going to answer that survey. It takes work. You have to then remind people, you have to call people up, you have to email them, whatever, to get a lot of responses back. So this is not, you will be disappointed in the results if you just send things out and then hope for the best. It will be a chore for all of us to do. So.
Okay, well, thank you for that. And I think that is totally accurate. So Jessica, I will reach out to you. I'm actually going out of town for a couple of days, so I will reach out to you next week and I'll connect with the person that you want to connect with. Kelly.
I just wanted to add one thing. When I was researching people who might be able to help us before I came along, Mr. Fishman, I had been emailing with a biologist from Syracuse University. And at the end of last meeting, I believe it was Jennifer was referencing something about carbon release into the atmosphere when you cut down a lot of trees. And though that was not something Mr. Fishman was an expert on, I did just want to read in the response from the professor who unfortunately couldn't help, with the meeting. But so in his email, he said, ecosystem impacts of quarrying are a bit removed from my expertise. If the forests around Gulf Road are typical for the area, they are second growth, which is exactly what Mr. Fishman said, 100 years old, perhaps older, in the steepest slopes, and serve as a carbon sink. They are removing more CO2 from the atmosphere than they release, which serves to decelerate global warming. I know no specifics of pouring, but I would guess the impacts would be similar to high density development where not only vegetation, but soils, in parentheses, which store about as much carbon as the trees they support, perhaps more, are destroyed and converted back to CO2, which enters the atmosphere. Eventual replacement of the area with solar panels is more environmentally friendly than a parking lot, but it would take a very long time to recoup the impacts of all the lost CO2 with solar. Further, if the limestone quarrying were for the concrete industry, there would be further impacts on CO2 release from processing the stone. And in parentheses, limestone is a CO2 rich rock. You could probably find someone to do an audit that would make these calculations if it mattered to your group.
Okay, that's a whole nother issue. Thank you.
I just thought it was worth, letting everybody know that.
Okay, well, thank you all very, very much. This is a terrific group. We appreciate your engagement. We will see you next month. And we have Doug Zamalius, is that how you pronounce it, Kelly? Will be our speaker.
I believe it's Zamlis.
Zamlis will be our speaker next month. And he is an attorney who is familiar with sort of the mine permitting process and some of the issues that may come up while we are evaluating basically what we just talked about, that we need to evaluate the application. So thank you. See you then.
Terrific.